Welcome to the 8th video in this review of basic Greek morphology based on 12 core patterns. In this video we continue reviewing the indicative of the primary tense forms, and now we're going to be looking at the future and the perfect. Our core pattern is still the pattern of personal endings for the primary tense forms. Let's begin with the future, the active and middle. We'll come to the passive later since it uses a different principal part. The future active and middle uses the second principal part. While luo doesn't change its stem in the future, there are a number of other verbs that do. For example, verbs ending in a liquid often have a slight modification. For example, hamartano becomes hamarteso in the future. And verbs that have a stem ending in the dental zeta usually drop the zeta when the sigma is added. That's why I included zeta in the dentals in the square of stops. Remember, it was ta delta theta zeta. So here you see harpazo becomes harpaso in the future. There are 8 main patterns of changes in the principal parts, and I briefly review them in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. So let's look further at this paradigm of the future tense form, beginning with luo. The endings are the same as those on the present tense form, so there are no new endings to learn if you know the core pattern. The tense form sign of the future is the sigma added to the stem. When the stem has one of the consonants that's in the square of stops, then it combines with the sigma in the ways that the square of stops indicate. So here we have the stem which ends in a labial, so when the sigma is added it becomes psi. Some verbs have a stem ending in a liquid or a nasal, lambda, mu, nu, or rho, and the sigma will not show up in the future. There will often be a slight modification in the stem, as we saw a minute ago, but not all liquids and nasals change their stems, as we can see in our example from Meno. The pattern of these liquids looks like the present tense form epsilon contract paradigm. So there are no new endings to learn, just remember to notice the stem ending. And when you see what looks like an epsilon contract present, it may be the future of the verb instead of the present. And the lexicon will let you know whether it's a contract verb or the future of a liquid. When you look that word up in a lexicon, you find meno, so you know it's going to be a liquid future. If it had been an epsilon contract present, then the lexical form would have been meneo. When we look at contract verbs in the future, they're very easy because they simply lengthen their stem ending. So the sigma tense form sign and the personal endings are all clearly present. The endings on me verbs are also clear. Recognizing the principal parts of the me verbs is more the challenge you have there. The future passives use primary endings, but remember it's built on the 6th principal part. Its tense form sign is theta eta sigma. That's added to the stem. So look over these paradigms and you'll see there are no new endings here. There's also a second future passive, which simply means that it lacks a theta, and sometimes it has a modified stem. So here we see the tense form sign is the eta sigma instead of theta eta sigma. The final bit of review for the future is the pattern of a me. It's another one of the 12 core patterns to learn. Though you see the endings are clear and follow the core pattern. Now let's move on to the perfect tense form. The perfect active uses the 4th principal part. That stem is often modified. For example, the perfect active of echo is eskeka. One of the signs of the perfect active is the reduplication on the front. Another sign is the kappa alpha tense form sign added to the stem. Notice that the endings follow the core pattern for primary endings. Since the zero form shows up in both the first singular and the third singular, the alpha shifts to an epsilon in the third singular so they can be distinguished. The third plural looks like the asin ending from the core pattern, so that should be easy to recognize. The perfect active of contract verbs are simple because they merely lengthen their stem ending, so the personal endings are clear. And the endings on me verbs are also clear. There's also a second perfect. As you see, the second perfect is the same as the first perfect, but without the distinctive kappa in the tense form sign, and it usually has a modified stem as well. Moving on to the perfect middle and passive, we come to the pattern that uses the 5th principal part. The perfect middle and passive has reduplication. One of the distinctives, though, is the lack of a tense form sign or a variable vowel. You see the endings are all clear and they follow the core pattern, at least when the stem is a vowel. Sometimes the lack of a tense form sign and variable vowel are the distinguishing features of one of its forms, especially if the verb begins with a vowel, If it begins with a vowel, then the reduplication is going to look like an augment. So for example, the perfect of artuo is ertumai. That looks like an augment on the front. So you see it's that lack of a tense form sign and a variable vowel. The fact that the ending is added directly to the stem, that's one of the key signals here for a perfect middle and passive. So the endings are those in the core pattern, but that lack of both a tense form sign and a variable vowel means that a stem that ends in a consonant will come up against a consonant in the ending, and that will cause modifications. So as with the square of stops, the consonants involved are the labials, velars, and dentals. Now most of these modifications don't obscure the original ending of the core pattern. So as you look over these forms, try to determine which ones will be hard to recognize when you meet them in a text. If you want to see a chart of these modifications, something like the square of stops, then see pages 51 and 52 in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. But there's probably enough of the core pattern forms left that you can recognize them without learning new charts. One other distinctive thing to note here is the use of a periphrastic participle construction for the third plural in the verbs whose stems end in consonants. Contract verbs in the perfect middle passive simply lengthen their stem ending, and since the stem ending is thus a vowel, the personal endings are clear. The endings on me verbs are also clear, since the stem ending is a vowel. So we've now reviewed the primary tense forms in the indicative mood. As you go through each of these paradigms, notice how the core pattern covers the endings with only a few modifications, and review the tense form signs and all the elements that go into each of the tenses. So now let's apply that material to a few examples in passages. For each example, I invite you to pause the video and see if you can recognize the verbs person, number, voice, and tense form. The ntai ending tells us this is a third plural, middle passive, and the theta eta sigma tense sign tells us it's a future, and that fine-tunes it to only being the passive, not a middle passive. And its lemma is asakuo. You see, this particular word has added a sigma before the tense form sign. Here's another one to try. In this case, our ending is tai, which tells us it's a third singular, either middle or passive. The lack of variable vowel points to a perfect middle passive, and the eta is the reduplication of an initial epsilon. The lemma is hetoimadzo. Now, what can you recognize in dedokos? Here our ending is sigma, and so we have a second singular active, and the tense form sign of kappa alpha points to it being a perfect, and the reduplication suggests that as well. Getting to the lemma is more of a challenge. In general, if you take everything off the front and back of a verb, and the stem is a delta with an omicron or an omega, then it probably comes from didomy. As we've seen in other videos, Danker and Newman in their lexicons provide help locating difficult forms. And websites like Perseus and Bible Hub also offer help, as we saw back in video 3. Here's one more sample to try. Bale here has an ending that's a zero form with epsilon or epsilon iota, so this should be a third singular active. The circumflex accent could point to a contract verb, but the stem is a liquid, which may point to a future, and so you got to check it out in the lexicon. The lexical form is balo, not baleo, and so you know it's not a present epsilon contract, it's going to be a future liquid. The second principal part of balo is balo, so this accent there, and the change in stem, it drops one of its lambdas, is the sign of the future. So here's a summary of what we've seen in these two videos on the primary tense forms and the indicative. We've got a core pattern that provides the endings, which give us the person, number, and voice. And then I list for you there the elements in the primary tense forms. Which principal part is used, which ones use reduplication, what their stem looks like, the tense signs, and the variable vowels. The lambda, mu, nu, and rho there in the future active and middle refer to those liquid or nasal futures. They're usually just called liquid futures. And I've got epsilon contract over there on the right to remind you that that's going to look like an epsilon contract present. And notice the final one, the perfect middle and passive, where I have that line indicating that there's no tense sign. And notice there's no variable vowel there either. So you should review those elements that go into the different tense form signs so you can recognize them, and then also review the pattern of a me. In the next video, we move on to the secondary tense forms.